All right, it's Wednesday night. It's our picnic weekend, and I've switched messages. Everything I do is in series. A lot of people don't understand that. You cannot preach everything there is to know about Christmas in one message. You can hardly preach it in a year. In fact, I went for a year where I preached about the orders of Christmas every Sunday for a year. Of course, when you do that, you're preaching prophecy. You're preaching from one end of the Old Testament, from Genesis. Let me erase this. You're preaching from Genesis to Malachi. Now, I've been accused by people, you just repeat yourself. One lady out in Oklahoma, she called and she said, I said, are you watching my DVD? She said, no, you just say the same thing over and over. I said, you're not watching, you're not paying any attention. So I started asking her questions, and she was getting everything wrong. I asked her, how many decrees were there concerning the 70 weeks of Daniel? She said there were 3. I said, wrong. I said, there were 4, first of all. And I said, who issued that 4th decree? She said, Cyrus. I said, no, Artaxerxes. If you're not paying attention and you're not learning the details, every one of the prophets prophesied concerning Israel either. Every one of the people around Israel were prophesying concerning Israel's apostasy. Now, if you don't know what apostasy means, let me explain it to you. Apostasy. A-P-O-S-T-A-S-I-A. A-P-O-S-T-A-S-I-A. And if you add a form of that was A-P-O-S-T-A-S-I-O-N. Apostasion is the word divorce. Israel had brought about their own divorce. Apostasia, it is a construction of apo and stasis. Now, stasis is a word that has many other words in its morphemes. Morphemes are word shapes. If you find a morpheme book, buy it. If it's a morphemes in the Bible. Morphemes. I've got a book, and I don't think it's up here, but it's just called Morphemes. And morpheme comes from the word morphe, which means word shapes. It means shapes of words. From stasis, you get several other words. You have the word cross, staros, which is a morpheme of stasis. Stasis means to stand. In other words, in these morphemes of stasis and sterao is the word crucify, and this word staros is the word cross. And a man in the first century who was said to be bearing his cross was said to be upright or standing upright. And you get the word stao, which is the word stake. And I don't want to get into that other than to say Jesus was crucified on a stake, not the way the Jehovah's Witnesses say. There was a stake that was set. It was an upright stake, and it was this, and you had a cross piece that the man would bear till he came to the place of crucifixion. The cross piece was called a patibulum. And the reason they planted a stake up on a hill, because they had tried for centuries. The Romans found out that didn't work. And for centuries, they would just put a stake, put a man on a cross, hanging up on a cross, and when he was hanging on the cross, they'd drop that stake in the ground, he'd come flying off the cross. So the Romans developed this stake, and they had him carry this patibulum, and this cross piece, that was the cross piece. And they had a notch up here, and they would twist that notch, and they had a footstool down there. So when they'd put him on it, they would twist it backwards, twist the cross piece backwards, the patibulum backwards, and it would throw him out of joint, and he'd have to push up on this footrest in order to be able to breathe. He could breathe in, but he couldn't exhale. And that was actually a stake in the ground, and they would put this cross piece, and the cross piece is the part he would bear. They would nail him to this part right here, then raise him up, and he'd have to push upward in order to be able to exhale. Well, that's why they went around to break the men's legs upon the crosses, and the two thieves, when they got to them, they were still alive. Well, of course, they could not have a man on a cross after sundown, because that's when the Sabbath began. That's another reason why Jesus was crucified on a Friday. So they went around and broke the other men's legs, but when they got to Jesus, he was already dead. They couldn't have broke his legs because he would not have met the criteria of being the Passover lamb. No bone of the Passover lamb could be broken. You go to the original Passover in Exodus, the 12th chapter, and they'll tell you that. So they would put him up on this stake, and then on that stake, that was actually a part of the cross, but they were two different pieces. Now, and we get this word stio, which is a word stake. And so actually a cross was a stake. Now, you had sterio, and you had the word histemi. I-S-T-E-M-I. Whether it looks like it to us or not, there were no H's. There was this diacritical mark, and the histemi meant to be upright. Stasis means to stand or be upright, and all these and more are a part of the same word. So Israel was apostate, and they didn't believe in a daily cross and doing what God says, just like to this day and time. The Bible says the day of the Lord will not come, there in 2 Thessalonians, that 2nd chapter, except there come a falling away first. Well, this word here, apostasis, is the word falling away, that we translated falling away from Christ at the end of time. And America is not the only one that's fallen away. All of the world has fallen away from Christ. Now, the apostasy is about everything in the Bible. It's Israel falling away from the work of God. Oh, I forgot to tell you, the title or the name of that upright post, was the, I started to say it, stipes. That was the stipes. The cross piece was the patibulum. So that they had titles for this. Now, when we're talking about Israel, we're talking about the lineage of Israel, started with Adam, went all the way down to Noah. The 10th from Adam was Noah. The 11th from Adam was his son Shem, and we get the word Shemitic from that. Shem, and Shem means authority. God blessed Shem, the second born, and he didn't bless his oldest, Japheth, and he did not bless his youngest, Ham. But he blessed Shem, and Shem carries on the lineage all the way to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Jacob's 12 sons became the nation of Israel. And you have to teach the whole Bible when you're teaching down to Jacob, and then his third-born son was Levi, and that's the priesthood. His fourth-born son was Judah, and that would be the king. King has to come out of Judah. The priest has to come out of Levi, or the Levites, or the Levitical law. And then the 12th born son, not 12th, 11th born son was Joseph. And out of Joseph's second born, Ephraim, would get the inheritance. Actually, Joseph received the inheritance through Ephraim, his second born, 11:2. So, 11 and 2, they go together from one end of the Bible to the other. Then God promises Israel, or Jacob, his name was changed to Israel. His name was changed to Israel. So Jacob becomes Israel, and his 12 sons become the nation of Israel under kings. And after Israel is in 400 years in bondage, God sends Moses to lead them out of bondage. And when they're coming out, they go to Mount Sinai, the first thing off the bat, and God tells Israel, this is the entire history of Israel. You're not just preaching on Christmas. When you preach Christmas, you're preaching the fire and tree worship. In everything, fire and tree worship of Israel, and tree worship, and all the nations that were around Israel, Syria, Babylon, Moab, Ammon, Edom, every one of the prophets is prophesying against these people that have polluted Israel with their sun and tree worship. Egypt, Israel went after all the gods of Egypt, of right below Israel, and right on the corner of southern Israel and the land of Moab, right on the southern corner is the land of Edom. That's the descendants of Esau, Edom. So whenever you are studying the Bible, you have to look at all of the prophets that prophesied against Israel. So if we're going to study the Old Testament, we've got to study about all the people that polluted Israel. And we also have to study not only these nations that polluted Israel, we've got to study the men that carried Israel away into captivity. That was God's beast. And the beast was, we said Sunday night, the beast was the Babylonian lion. And we said Sunday night who that was and why it was. Because Babylon was the most regal of all the empires, and the lion was the king of the beast. It is considered the most regal or stately of all the empires. It was gorgeous. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon are one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world. When you're coming across the desert and you see Babylon, and Babylon was a square city with a river running through it. The river was the Euphrates, and they had learned, Euphrates means double fruit. They had learned to build aqueducts, all kinds of water systems in there, and when you're coming across the desert, you see the walls of this city, they were like 375 to 400 feet high. 400 feet high. And they were, it was utterly magnificent because you had all these plants growing, and they were watering them with the waters of the Euphrates. And they were shipping these fruits and vegetables all over that part of the world through the Euphrates River. And these walls were 14 miles by 14 miles by nearly 400 feet high. It looked like an unbelievable thing. It's about 14 miles if you go down here to the interstate to Nashville. It's like having a wall from the interstate all the way to Nashville, 14 miles long. That's what the city looked like. It was like, what in the world is this? That's why Nebuchadnezzar said, is this not great Babylon that I have built? Well, they learned how to feed those plants and flowers, and it was beautiful, like you couldn't imagine. We'd never seen anything like that in the world with that many flowers and plants. Well, all these nations, Babylon polluted Israel, carried them away into captivity, and then Babylon was overthrown by Persia. Persia is Iran. Actually, Persia is Iran, is Iran, Afghanistan. It's all the stands, Turkestan. I can't remember how you pronounce all those names. They got them. It's all of this, for those of you that can see, it's all this area.
Yeah, it's on the computer, it's on the TV.
What?
It's on the TV.
I don't know if I can see it. Let me see here. Do I have anything with it all? Oh, maybe here. Persia. Well, I got it. I can't. You can't see all of Persia there. Okay, maybe right here. Iran. This is Persia. Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan. All of this was Persia. No India. Alexander the Great went to conquer India, and he didn't do any good. Most of his soldiers died going over there. So you got Pakistan, Afghanistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkestan, Uzbekistan. Notice this Kazakhstan, and people have never even heard of this, have you? Have you ever heard of Kazakhstan?
Yes.
Has anybody ever heard of that?
Yes, I've heard of it.
Have you?
That's where my dad spent his career.
Okay, well, Kazakhstan is larger than all these others put together. That's amazing, isn't it? Now, so all of Persia overthrew. Iraq is Babylon. Babylon went on up to between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. Now, so they overthrew Babylon, took their charges, which would be Israel, under their wing. And the amazing thing about Persia, they're the ones that gave the decrees for Israel to go back and build the temple and build the city. Who gave the first decree? Cyrus. And what year did he give that? What? I can't hear. Somebody's talking. 538. Okay, thank you. BC. All right, and who gave the second decree? Darius. That's right. What chapters in the Bible do you find the first decree?
Ezra 1.
Well, it's not the only place. 2 Chronicles 36 and Ezra, the first chapter. Where is the second decree? Where is it given?
6 and 7.
What?
Ezra 6 and 7.
No, not 7.
For the fourth decree. I mean the third.
Well, Ezra 6 is the second decree. Except it wasn't a decree to rebuild anything. What was the decree for? Huh? I can't hear with everybody talking. What was the second decree for?
To verify the first.
Verify that. Quit answering. Dave knows all the answers. He studied me for about 10 years. And then the third decree was in what? In what chapter?
7.
Chapter 7. And what was that for?
Rebuild the temple.
It's what?
To rebuild the temple.
No.
Wasn't it to send their materials back?
Take material and priests to the temple. And what was the fourth decree?
To rebuild the
To rebuild the city. Boy, you've been watching these, haven't you?
She's looking at notes.
To rebuild the city. And the second decree was given in what year? Huh?
522.
What?
522 BC.
No.
520 BC.
What happened in 522 BC?
Oh, they stopped Darius. How does it too?
What? What happened in 522?
Is that 520 BC?
522.
Darius is king.
Darius ascended the throne.
Right, but I'm saying he gave them to go back in 520, right? 2
What?
years after? He told them to go back in 520 BC, though, right?
He what? I can't.
20
He
was the
said-
decree.
That's what 20 is the decree, is what I'm saying, right?
He gave the second decree in 520.
Okay.
And
So my
that
notes
was
match
and
yours.
that was to supply the temple. What year was the temple finished?
Oh, 444.
No.
516 BC.
The temple finished. What year was the temple finished? What year were they carried away?
586.
Huh?
586.
586. How long were they in Babylon? 70 years. So add 70 to 586, and what do you get?
516.
516. 516 is when the temple was finished. Now, what year and who gave the third decree?
Artaxerxes.
Dave?
Darius.
Oh, Darius.
No, Artaxerxes gave the third decree.
Right, that's what I
You're
said.
right.
That's what you said. Don't
Teacher's pet.
back up. All right. Now, who gave the fourth decree and who was it given to?
Artaxerxes to Nehemiah.
Nehemiah.
Dave, you got to be quiet. Let some of these other people answer.
I got the Nehemiah part.
He gave it to Nehemiah. How did he give it to me at Nehemiah?
Oh, they went to find it.
Huh?
Didn't they go to find it? Try to
No, that was the second decree. They looked for the first decree. Because you can't give a decree after it's given in Persia because their decrees weren't alterable. And so if Artaxerxes gave the decree, what year did he give it? Gave the fourth decree. What? 444. That's when he was given. It was given by Artaxerxes in 444. And that's in what chapter of the Bible?
Nehemiah the second.
Nehemiah the second chapter. And how, in what form did Artaxerxes give this decree to rebuild the city to Nehemiah? How did he give it to it? Anybody remember? He wrote him a letter.
John got it.
Is that what you said, John? He wrote a letter. And any time a Persian king writes a letter, it's the same thing as the fact that he wrote a letter to rebuild the city. These people that say the beginning of the 70 weeks of Daniel was the first decree or the second decree or the third decree, that would be completely against their law to write a letter to say rebuild the city if it had already been given. That was to be against their law. And the king couldn't do that. Right? You couldn't, the king himself knew if there had already been a decree given to rebuild the city, he couldn't write a letter. He'd say, we'll have to reaffirm the decree where it was given. There's no way he could have written a letter. So we know that it started there when he gave Nehemiah a letter to rebuild the city. How long did it take them to rebuild the city?
14 years.
Huh?
14 years.
No. How many years after Nehemiah left did he go back to Artaxerxes? If Artaxerxes gave the decree in 444, he was 12 years in rebuilding the city So he went back home in 432, since they gave it in 444. Now, what I want to do is give you, and all of these people around Israel, whether it's the Idumeans, which are Esau's descendants, whether it's Egypt, whether it's Babylon, Persia, Syria. Does anybody remember the god of the Syrians, or the goddess of the Syrians that Israel got in worshiping? Probably you won't remember this. I don't mention it much. Rimmon. Israel got involved in worshiping Rimmon. She got involved in worshiping the gods of the Egyptians. Where do you find that she got involved in worshiping all these other gods?
Yeah, exactly.
What?
The Old Testament?
Old Testament, somewhere in the Old Testament. It's kind of like one time I asked where something was, and I was in a question and answer period, and Sid was sitting out front, and he said, I said, where's so-and-so? He said, up there. I said, where? He said, on that map. It was this map. No, it was another map of that. Anyway, now, all these nations, one of the best places to find that Israel was going after all these gods is in Ezra, the 9th chapter, the first 2 verses. Turn over there. They weren't just worshiping. A lot of times I'll say Israel was worshiping Baal in the grove. Baal in the grove, Baal was just another name for Hercules. When you look at Baal in McClintock and Strong, these are the very words it will say. It will say, when you look at Baal, it'll say, the Tyrian Hercules. All these gods were the same thing because all the males were fire gods, were sun gods. They were children of the sun. And all the females were children of the moon, or the moon goddess. If you watch one of these Saturday afternoon shows, and it's got one of those old bodybuilders playing Hercules in Rome, they'll bring him out and say, he's the child of the sun. Those old cheap movies have got that exactly right, because he was called the sun god. And the female deities were the moon goddesses, which was represented as a tree. Now, look over here in Ezra. This is a place where you can find many of the gods that Israel was serving. All right. Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. Ezra. I'll get it here in a minute. Ezra, the 9th chapter. What's happening in Ezra, the 9th chapter? Does anybody remember? What? Who was Ezra? What?
They were taking strange wives.
Mike's saying intermarriage. Mike is saying intermarriage.
Saying what?
Intermarriage.
Well, that's true. Who was Ezra? He was what kind of priest? He was a high priest. That means he was a descendant of who? Aaron. He was a descendant of Aaron. Anytime you see a high priest, Ezra was he was a descendant of either Ithamar or Eleazar. Those were the 2 sons of Aaron that all the priesthood came from.
Didn't he also put the Old Testament together?
It was Ezra that's given credit for correlating all of the Old Testament. He's been given that credit for having done that. And here in Ezra, now Ezra is right after 2nd Chronicles. Where does that put him in prophecy? That means he is during the time of Israel's being carried over here to Babylon. Now he's in Babylon. He's been given the third decree by Artaxerxes. Ezra's given the third decree to come back over here to Israel and bring supplies. This is in Ezra, the 7th chapter. You realize without Ezra, we don't have the decrees for the 70 weeks. And Nehemiah was a contemporary of Ezra. Ezra come back over here in 457, 56, somewhere in that neighborhood. And Nehemiah's been given the decree to rebuild the city in what year? I just asked you a while ago.
444.
Huh?
444.
444. So Nehemiah's bringing a decree over here just 13 years after Nehemiah. He's been bringing a decree over here to rebuild the city. So while Ezra's getting the temple prepared, Nehemiah is his friend and his buddy. In fact, you can see Ezra reading the book of the law in Nehemiah, the 8th chapter. So that makes them pals, doesn't it? Before I look here in Ezra, the 9th chapter, you got to learn to correlate these things together. In Nehemiah, the 8th chapter, now Nehemiah's writing this book, right? Notice this in Nehemiah. I want you to notice these two guys knew each other well. One's got a decree to supply the temple with priests, with goats, with sheep, with the uniforms of the priesthood. That's Ezra bringing them over here in 457. And 13 years later, his pal, who knew him over here in Babylon, who is Nehemiah, is bringing the decree, first-time decree, to rebuild the city. Can't you imagine what they felt when they got together? And look in Nehemiah, the 8th chapter, then we'll go over here to the other. Look here in the 8th chapter. This is Nehemiah's account. 8th chapter, and all the people gathered themselves together as one man in the street. That was before the Watergate. You thought that was just a Nixon thing, didn't you? They had gates. They had different gates to the city. They had the sheep gate where they sold sheep. They had the dung gate where they sold dung, and they had the water gate where people could get water. And they spake unto Ezra the scribe. Oh, a scribe was a high-class priest. He was the top line of the priesthood, well studied, to bring the book of the law of Moses, which the Lord had commanded to Israel. And Ezra the priest brought the law. Remember, this is in the book of Nehemiah. So me and Nehemiah knew him very well. Before the congregation, both of men and women, and all that could hear with understanding, upon the first day of the 7th month, and he read the book of the law half a day there. He just standing up there reading it to the people. I just wanted to point out to you that Ezra and Nehemiah were men that loved each other. They were there fighting this battle together. Now back over here to Ezra, the 9th chapter. This is where Ezra, so Ezra and Nehemiah, those books belong together because they were two men walking in accord, bringing the supplies for the temple, and the other one's bringing the command to rebuild the city over there. That's good to know, isn't it? To know that they had each other. Then you go to the 9th chapter of Ezra, and Ezra comes into town. He's been over in Babylon. He's bringing this decree to rebuild the city. Not to rebuild this, to restructure the temple and to bring sacrifices and priests. They need more priests over here, so he's bringing some of them. Now, this is what he comes back and finds. he finds Israel doing the same thing that caused them to be scattered. We're talking about, this is in 457, and they were carried away into captivity in 586 BC. That's when they were carried into captivity. This is 140 years later. And you'd think that they would know what they'd been carried in captivity about, wouldn't you? Evidently they forgot. And now when these things were done, the princes came to me saying, the people of Israel and the priests and the Levites have not separated themselves over here in Israel from the pagans. They're marrying them. From the people of the lands, doing according to the abominations, even of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Egyptians. They're going after the gods of the Egyptians. How many gods did the Egyptians have? Thousands. We can name a few. Amun-Ra. Huh? Thoth. You've got all kinds of gods. You've got Osiris and Isis, and the list goes on and on. And Israel said, yeah, we'll take your gods, bring them on. And they've been over here in captivity for 140 years without any thought of what they're doing to God. So is America. What's amazing, they were 500 years before they were scattered. It's a wonder God don't scatter America right now. And we've only been, as of 1976, we were a nation for 200 years then. We have been a nation for 225, 24 plus 10 plus 7, 24 and 34 and plus 7, and 41 years. We've been a nation 300 years, close to 300, a little over 300. And look what God is doing to us. Not 300, 250 years, closer to it. And when is God going to do something about America? It's a wonder he hasn't already destroyed us. So he says, they have taken of their daughters for themselves and for their sons, so that the holy seed have mingled themselves with the people of those lands. Yea, the hand of princes and rulers have been chief in this trespass. He said the rulers of Israel, the priests. Well, Nehemiah tells us all about that in Nehemiah the 13th chapter. One of the biggest enemies that Israel had, Nehemiah's greatest enemy, was a man named Sanballat. This was Nehemiah's enemy. Nehemiah. Sanballat. So when you get to Nehemiah, this is the man that causes all the problems for Nehemiah. He tries to get Nehemiah to come into the temple. Well, Nehemiah couldn't come into the temple. He wasn't a priest. It's believed that cupbearers were usually men who had been emasculated. They were men who could not raise up children against the king. It's believed that Nehemiah was probably a eunuch. And he really, really cared about Artaxerxes, and Artaxerxes cared about him. We're talking about like brother, like father and son, or brother and brother. We don't know if Artaxerxes was a believer, but he loved Nehemiah just like Darius loved Daniel, just like Nebuchadnezzar loved Daniel. Now, and then you had, when you get to Nehemiah, the big enemy of the city of God, of rebuilding the city, was Sanballat and the Arabian, and one named Tobiah. These were the enemies that tried to stop the building of the city. Then when you're back over here in the book of Ezra, the people of God had an enemy over there. Does anybody remember who that was in the book of Ezra? Huh? Tatnai. Keep these men separated. Tatnai. He was trying to raise up and stop these men from rebuilding the temple, and Sanballat was trying to stop Nehemiah from rebuilding the city. Keep those men separated, because when you get into them, boy, there's something else. And when you get into that 13th chapter of Nehemiah, look over there real quick. Without Ezra and Nehemiah, there would be no 70 weeks of Daniel. Do you know I've never heard a preacher preach on Ezra and Nehemiah and say anything like that? 3 of the decrees were in Ezra. The 4th decree is in the 2nd chapter of Nehemiah. And these are the decrees for the rebuilding of the city, which begins the 70 weeks of Daniel, taking you all the way to Jesus. Now, I'm trying to explain to you, whenever you're teaching the Old Testament, you're teaching all these characters, all these nations, all their enemies, and the judgment that God is bringing upon Israel and the nations around them for having polluted Israel, even though God ordered it. Boy, how do you get around that? That's the sovereignty of God, isn't it? When you look over here in the 13th chapter, the city has just been finished. They just finished building the city over in that 9th chapter. And this is the first day of the opening of the gates of the city when Nehemiah finishes building it. He doesn't build it alone. He's got all of these workers, these carpenters, these men that lay stone and brick and so forth. And when he gets over here, he says, in those days I saw Judah, some treading, this is verse 15, treading presses on the Sabbath. That is an indictment against Israel. They're not supposed to be working on the Sabbath. And bringing in sheaves on the Sabbath. They're not supposed to be harvesting on the Sabbath. And lading asses. They're not supposed to be working on the Sabbath at all. What are they to be doing on the Sabbath? Huh? Where is that in the Bible? Where is it that they're supposed to stay in their houses in the Bible? There's a verse here you need to memorize and keep it in your head, at least where it is. 16th chapter. This you need to know where this is. Don't have to memorize it, but you got to know where it is. Verse 27, 28, and 29 of Exodus, the 16th chapter. Let me read 27 through 29. And it came to pass that there went out some of the people on the 7th day for to gather, and they found none. And the Lord said unto Moses, how long refuse you to keep my commandments and my laws? They're looking for manna on the Sabbath. Why is it they found none on the Sabbath?
Well, they're supposed to keep enough.
Huh? Why?
They're supposed to keep enough.
Why, Gwen?
Double it on Friday, so they would have it.
God gave them enough on Friday for the Sabbath. They don't find any on the Sabbath. Are they paying any attention to God? I don't think they are. How long refuse you to keep my commandments and my laws? I told you I'd give you enough on the 6th day for the 7th. What happened if they kept enough for the next day on Tuesday? It would get worms in it and it would rot. Now, why didn't it happen on the Friday when they took enough for 2 days? Because that was God's miracle. See, for that the Lord hath given you the Sabbath. Therefore, he giveth you on the 6th day the bread of 2 days. I told you that already. Don't you listen to me and pay attention, God is saying? Abide ye every man in his place. Let no man go out of his place on the Sabbath day. What does that mean?
Nothing.
Stay in your house on the Sabbath day and rest and sleep. Don't do nothing. Don't go to a church. You can't go to a church. Nobody's going to the temple but the priest. You're supposed to stay at home, sleep, do nothing. These Seventh-day people, they don't really believe in the Sabbath. If they did, they'd stay at home on the Sabbath. The Sabbath is every day now, we know that. So the people rested on the seventh day. This is a good thing to know. They couldn't have any fires on the Sabbath. They couldn't ride a donkey. You can't get in a car and steer a car and do work on the Sabbath. They couldn't have any entertainment, no pleasure whatsoever. That means you can't watch basketball games on the Sabbath, and you can't go outside and play. You can't move any furniture. What are you going to do on Saturday? Well, we thought about moving some furniture around that. You can't do that. You can't cook on the Sabbath. People say, well, we don't keep it that way. We keep it the way we want to. Oh, you changed the Word of God. You can't do anything. You can't watch college football on the Sabbath.
Hooray.
Forget it. Mary said, hooray. All right. Then over here in chapter 13, the people were intermarried with these women. In verse 23, in those days also saw I Jews that had married wives of Ashdod. That's one of the cities of the Philistines. And of Ammon, that's one of the cities in Ammon. Ammon was northern Jordan, and those are all pagans, and that's where Israel come up with Molech worship from the Ammonites. Molech or Moloch or Malcolm or Milcom or Moloch. Well, ain't no wonder. And then what really is serious about this in verse 24, and their children spake half in the speech of Ashdod and could not speak the Jews' language. The law was only written in the Jews' language. So these mothers could not teach their children the law. The little kids didn't understand it. They married, intermarried, and the law is not given to the Gentiles till when? Acts 2. That's when he pours out of his Spirit on all flesh, red, yellow, white, black, and brown flesh, not the Jews anymore. And then down here in verse 28, he said they're intermarrying with these people, and he illustrates to us Solomon. Solomon married 700 wives and 300 strange wives. Didn't mean weird. It meant foreign wives and 300 concubines. And he says here in verse 26, did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin by these things, by marrying these women? Among many nations was there no king like him, who was beloved of his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, even him did these outlandish women cause to sin. Are you smarter than Solomon? You can mix your life up with heathenism. Shall we then hearken unto you and do all this great evil to sin, to transgress against our God in marrying strange women? He was trying to keep the peace in Israel. How do you keep the peace in Israel? Obey God and you'll conquer all of your enemies. You don't have to marry daughters. And that's what they did back in that day and time. They would intermarry their daughters with some foreign king that was their natural enemy. That way they could keep peace. God says all you have to do is obey my statutes, commandments, and when you do that, you'll be able to conquer your enemies no matter how many there are. You go against them one way and they'll flee 7 ways. They can have 1,000,000, you could have 2. And I'll cause you to beat them all.
No, nothing has changed.
Nothing's changed.
They were mixing truth with a lie.
And verse 28 was what really gets me. And one of the sons of Jehoiada, the son of Eliashib, the high priest, was son-in-law to Nehemiah's greatest enemy, Sanballat. The Horonite, therefore I chased him from me. Get out of my way. He's mad. He pulls their beards out, pulls their hair out. People think that I'm hard. You better be glad Nehemiah's not here. He'd be embarrassing you really bad. He'd be going down to the big Baptist church, yanking a guy out of the pulpit, kicking him off the front steps. And somebody, who's that nut down there? He said his name was Nehemiah. If he was here, that's what he'd be doing. They'd be throwing him in jail. Now, when you're studying the Bible, you have to understand that all the prophets, I said last week that there were 5 major prophets. Does anybody remember who those 5 are? Who said Moses? Didn't want to leave him out this time, did you? Nobody could think of him last week. Moses. All right. Moses and who else? Moses. So if you're going to study Moses, you're going to have to study what books?
The Torah.
Huh?
The Torah.
You're going to have to study Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. How many?
5 books.
All right. You're going to have to, now it's believed that Moses wrote all these books. Well, he did, except he couldn't have written the very end of Deuteronomy, could he? Why is that? Well, let's look at the end of Deuteronomy. Just look at the end of Deuteronomy, the last chapter. Verse 5, Moses couldn't have written this. The last chapter, chapter 34. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab. Where's Moab?
Jordan.
Moab is the same thing as southern Jordan. Let me see here. Can you, well, that's too small. Wait a minute, see here. All right. We speak of Mount Pisgah. Mount Pisgah's lofty heights. What song is that in? Mount Pisgah. Moses was taken upon Mount Pisgah, and God said, you cannot cross over the river. You can't go over there, and you can't take possession of the land. And Moses wept and pled with God, I want to go. No, you can't go. Why was it he couldn't go?
And they struck the rock.
Well, what chapter is that in? What book?
Oh, I didn't know that. That's in Exodus.
Huh?
Somewhere in Exodus.
Well, I don't think so.
Oh my goodness, I didn't have a book right.
Huh?
I said I don't even have a book.
I don't think it's there in Exodus.
Is it Genesis?
No, I think it's in Numbers.
Oh. All right. I couldn't-
Remember, Numbers is about what?
Numbering Israel.
What?
Numbering Israel.
What have I told you? The journey. Here's Israel. And here's the Sinai Peninsula. And here's Egypt, the Delta land. And here is the Red Sea. And they come across the Red Sea, going to the Sinai Peninsula, and they stay there in the Sinai Peninsula till Numbers, the 10th chapter. Then they go up here to Kadesh Barnea. They refuse the commandment of God to go in there and conquer these men of Anak. The land of Anak, what do we call it today? Huh?
Palestine.
What do we call the land of Anak today? The Gaza Strip. Gaza Strip. And what did they call it in the days of David, back in the kings of Israel?
Saigon,
Huh?
Tyre, Sodom.
No. It's not Tyre and Sidon down here. Tyre and Sidon's up here. What did they call this during the days of David? Land of what?
The Philistines? Philistines.
The land of what?
John's saying Philistines.
Land of the Philistines. Thank you, John. The land of the Philistines. The Gaza Strip, the land of Anak, these were called Anakims, and they were real tall people. And they were gigantic. In all probability, ancestors of Goliath. Goliath was estimated at 9 feet 6 inches tall.
No kidding to me.
That's a lot of man, isn't it? Whew. Now, I was saying that for some reason. All right.
Was in them.
Now, Numbers is the time period from where they leave in Numbers 10. He's numbering tribes before that. There's a part of truth to that. But most of Numbers is about the adventures of Israel for 40 years in the wilderness. Why were they given 40 years?
Because they didn't go across.
That's it. Good.
They were not doing what God says, go over there, take the land, and everybody over.
But why 40 years?
Because they would be 60.
Because what?
Generation.
Because they would
It
be
was a generation.
60 years
Right?
old.
That generation could not enter.
Because 4 goes with 7.
Okay,
Why
there's
40
no one-
years?
Right.
They scouted the land for 40 days.
That's right. They scattered the land for 40 days, a year for a day. And God says, what I'm going to do, I'm going to have you wander in the wilderness. I'm going to kill off all the unbelievers. Remember what we equated that with over here in the New Testament? What did we equate that with?
Inner and outer man.
The believer. The inner man, Christ in you. Christ in you, the hope of glory. And the outer man who doesn't want to quit sinning. Outer man is the flesh, isn't it? If we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves and the truth is not in us. Whosoever is born of God, the inner man, Christ in you, that's by the will of God. John, the first chapter there, we were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor the will of man, but of God. That's the inner man. That's the new birth. Whosoever is born of God doth not commit sin, for his seed remaineth in him, and he cannot sin. So the same thing they went through for 40 years in the wilderness, God has to take us through his 4 judgments. Notice that's a form of 40. 4 judgments. Any multiple of 10 or 100 or 1,000, the Jews said in the first century it was a form of that original number. Any multiple of 10, 40 would be a form of 4. 400 would be a form of 4. And each time you find those 4s, you'll find that, gosh, I don't need to get numbers, y'all excuse me. All right. So through our lifetime, God's got to kill off that outer man. The same way he's going to kill off these unbelievers in Israel. And none of those people that are 20 years old or older that were at Kadesh Barnea that went in to spy out the land, none of those young men are going to enter into the land. Why 20 years old?
Military age.
Huh?
Military age.
That's military age. That's draft age in Israel. You had to be 20. Draft age. So 20 years old, nobody above 20 years old, nobody above 20 years old is going to enter into the land of Israel. 20 or older is going to enter in. Except 2 men. Who's that?
Caleb.
And why them?
They obeyed God.
Why them?
They spied out the land.
But why them?
They didn't murmur.
They're few.
What did they want to do? They wanted to go attack. They said, look, God delivered us through for the greatest army that ever existed in the form of Pharaoh and his armies. He certainly can whip these giants. So they said, we'll go. And these are the only two older men that came into Israel. And Joshua was their leader. And Caleb's nephew was the first judge after Joshua died. What was Caleb's nephew's name?
Oh,
I've said it a bunch of times.
I know. We're failing you.
It starts with an O. Othniel. That was the first judge after Joshua died. He was Caleb's nephew. Now, where was I? All right. Where was I in Numbers? Oh, Numbers 20. Numbers 20. And here's why Moses did not get to go into the land, right here. Boy, they were argumentative. This is also the chapter where Moses' sister dies. Who was his sister? Miriam. Was she younger or older than Moses?
She was older.
How do we know that?
Because she watched his basket go down the river.
Huh?
Because she watched his basket go down the river.
She's the one that put him in the water when he was a baby in a little bitty ark and floated down, and what's her name took him out of the water.
Yeah, what's her name?
What's her name? Pharaoh's daughter took him out of the water. Yeah. All right, now here's why he couldn't go. And I'm going to go into him pleading with the Lord later. Because he pled with the Lord. He cried and wept, said, please let me go. And God said no. Because of this right here. Verse 7, and the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, take the rod, and gather thou the assembly together, and Aaron thy brother, and speak ye unto the rock. Just talk to the rock. Now back in Exodus 17 and 5, he said, hit the rock twice. They're crying against me. But this Exodus, the 5th chapter, 17th chapter, they were just barely in the wilderness. They weren't founded on anything yet. The 14th chapter, well, I didn't mean to tell you that. The 14th chapter, what happened in the 14th chapter of Exodus? Does anybody know? It was after the Passover, that's right. Why is that? Why was it after the Passover?
Red Sea.
Because the Passover was in what chapter? 12th chapter. If it's in the 14th chapter, it has to be after the Passover. That's what she's reading with. All right. If it's after the Passover. The 14th chapter, they're down in the Red Sea, on the bottom of the sea, and it's dry. It's just as dry as it can be. And they're going through the bottom of the Red Sea, and what does God do?
Yeah, that's what I said. Which time are we talking
He
about?
pulls the wheels off of their chariots. God says, now drive against my people now. What chance did Pharaoh have? Was Moses standing on the side? Was he standing over there going, won't you come, please come, and accept me as your personal Savior? No, Pharaoh, there was no chances with Pharaoh and his armies. They drowned in the Red
Because
Sea.
he rejected God, right?
Huh?
They would say that's because he rejected God.
He didn't reject God. He never had a chance. He wasn't given ears to hear. Who did Moses come to? He came to his people in Egypt, not to Pharaoh, not to the Egyptians. The Egyptians are pictures of the vessels of wrath fitted to destruction. They wasn't coming into the land. Well, that's a poor excuse. So you've got, as God put you through fire and trials for about 40 years, all kinds of problems, divorce, losing your house, losing your health, all of this outer man begins to die off. As they go through the wilderness, God sees to it that these men that murmured against him and said, we can't go into the land, God's going to see that those people are going to die in the wilderness. They die right and left, don't they? They sure do.
Were they unbelievers?
Huh?
Or just
There was a lot of them unbelievers out there in the wilderness. I don't know if God, I don't believe that Aaron was an unbeliever when he made a golden calf. He was a high priest of Israel. He did some bad things, but he made this golden calf, and then when Moses comes down off the mountain, Moses is in a rage. What are you doing here, Aaron, big brother? He was 3 years older than Moses. And Aaron said, well, these people brought me this gold and we threw it into the fire and this calf jumped out. Yeah.
I can't believe he said
You think I believe that, Aaron? That's exactly what he said. Aaron didn't have a lot on the ball. Let's read the rest of this. And Moses took the rod from before the Lord as he had commanded him, verse 9. And Moses and Aaron gathered the congregation together before the rock, and he said unto them, Hear now, ye rebels. Look back at verse 3. And the people chid with Moses. They argued with Moses, saying, Would God we had died when our brethren died before the Lord, and why have you brought us up in the congregation of the Lord into this wilderness that we and our cattle should die here? He's angry at him. When God tells him to speak to the rock, he's just huffing, puffing, angry at Israel. Verse 11, Moses lifted up his hand with his rod. He smote the rock twice. God didn't tell him to do that. I've puzzled over this. Why would God keep him out of the land? He wanted to keep him out, and he put this rebellion in Moses. Moses wasn't rebelling against God. He thought he was rebelling against the people. And the water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank, and their beasts also. And the Lord spake to Moses and Aaron, Because ye believed me not, to sanctify me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this congregation into the land which I have given them. This is the water of Meribah, because the children of Israel strove with the Lord, and he was sanctified in them. And God says, Moses, you are forbidden to go into the land. Look at Deuteronomy 3. 3. Now, God's not... How much time do I have, Mike?
26.
What?
26.
26. All right. Look here at Deuteronomy 3 and verse 23. 3 and 23. All right. Read in verse 21. And I commanded Joshua at that time, saying, Thine eyes have seen all that the Lord your God hath done unto these two kings, so shall the Lord do unto all the kingdoms whither you pass. You shall not fear them, for the Lord your God, he shall fight for you. And I besought the Lord at that time, saying, This is Moses. O Lord God, thou hast begun to show thy servant thy greatness in thy mighty hand. For what God is there in heaven and in earth that can do according to thy works and according to thy might? I pray thee, let me go over. This is a very sad spot. And see the good land that is beyond Jordan, that goodly mountain in Lebanon. And the Lord was wroth with me for your sakes, and would not hear me. And the Lord said unto me, Let it suffice thee, speak no more unto me of this matter. Don't you bring this up again. Have you ever told your kids that? God tells Moses, don't you talk to me about this again. Get thee up in the top of Mount Pisgah. He gets to look, but he can't go in. And lift up thine eyes westward and northward and southward and eastward, and behold it with thine eyes, for thou shalt not go over this Jordan. I'm going to let you look and see from Mount Pisgah. Maybe that song will mean more to you now. But charge Joshua and encourage him and strengthen him, for he shall go over before this people. He's going to be my leader when they enter in to take charge of the land in the first chapter of Judges. He's going to go in before then, and he's going to conquer the cities. When he goes in to take over, it'll be in the first chapter of Judges. And he shall cause them to inherit the land which thou shalt see. So we abode in the valley over against Beth Peor. Now, so Moses don't get to go in. Joshua leads them in. The book of Joshua is about dividing up the land. It's about Joshua coming in and attacking Jericho in the 6th chapter of Joshua. That's where 7 priests with 7 trumpets encompassed the city on the 7th day 7 times. On the 7th time they blow the last trump, and the walls fall down immediately, and judgment comes. And he goes in here to conquer Ai. He comes in to conquer Ai. That's where one of the men took a little wedge of gold and a goodly Babylonian garment, and God told him not to do that. And Joshua said, kill him, stone him. Well, it was tough going in there and taking possession of the land. And all these towns, he would go in and conquer them. That's in the book of Joshua. And Joshua's the one that divided up for the different tribes, Dan here, Ephraim here, Benjamin here, Judah here, Simeon here. But Simeon was numbered with northern Israel, not southern Judah. Southern Judah was the land of Benjamin and Judah. That's what comprised. I believe the reason God put Simeon right in the middle of southern Judah, being numbered with northern Israel, because of his sneaky underhandedness when he went in and killed Shechem, who had had an affair with his sister. Who was the sister of Simeon? Who was the sister of, who was the only daughter of Jacob? I'll put it that way. Dinah. I always think of Dinah Shore. Of course, most of the young people don't remember her. She was a big famous singer, and that was Jacob's daughter, Dinah. And who was Shechem's father? Hamor. Yeah. And because she had an affair with Dinah, had a sexual affair with Shechem, and she was in love with him, and he was in love with her, and they wanted to get married. And the only way they could get married is they would become Israelites, and the only way they could do that was by circumcision. When they were all circumcised, Simeon said, all right, now, brother Levi, he recruited Levi to go with him, to go in there and kill all those men while they were disabled, circumcised. They went in and murdered them all. And what did Jacob have to say about that? Oh, Jacob was upset. He said, you brought reproach upon Israel, Simeon. And I believe that's why he was stuck down here in the middle of Judah. That's the only thing I can come up with until somebody else tells me something different. So Joshua, in the book of Joshua, he set the boundary lines for the tribes. Then when you get into the Judges, that was the system where they started bringing all of these gods into Israel. They brought Baal, they brought the grove, they brought the Ashtaroth. What was the Ashtaroth?
Tree gods.
Huh?
Tree gods.
Well, what was it the name for?
Ashtaroth, Ashtoreth.
Huh? It was a generic term for all the tree goddesses, whoever they were. You can look up Ashtaroth in the McClintock and Strong, And it will tell you under Ashtaroth that Venus was never worshipped in human form. When you see Venus de Milo, that's a modern thing here several hundred years ago, and it's got arm missing. That's not a real true Venus. They said Venus was always shaped in the form of a cone. Form of a cone. And since they were deified in the stars, they always put a star on the top of them. That's what Layard's Nineveh says. And of course, Jeremiah the 10th chapter said they put a platform on them because they couldn't go. They couldn't walk around, so they set them on a platform. And then Jeremiah the 10th chapter says they wrapped them in these garlands of gold and silver. I don't know what that looks like to y'all. It certainly looks like a Christmas tree to me. Now, all right. I'm just kind of going through here, letting you see these things. Now, you come out of, if you're going to study the wilderness, you got to study from Exodus, the 12th chapter, where the last plague was, which was the Passover. And you got to study from Exodus. People say, you keep repeating yourself. We need to study Exodus, don't we? Goodness gracious. And we need to study through, we study through Exodus, and we got to study Leviticus. There's so many things in Leviticus. The first 9 chapters of Leviticus are about the washing of the priesthood, their dedication. That's 1 through 9. How they had to be sanctified and made holy. You get in 10, and some crazy events start happening. Does anybody know what happened in the 10th chapter of Leviticus? Aaron had 2 sons.
Nadab and Abihu.
Huh?
Nadab and Abihu.
Nadab and Abihu. That's where they offered strange fire, was in Leviticus, the 10th chapter. Strange fire. I don't know what the strange fire was. It could be one of several things. The fire they offered before the Lord, you had 2 fires in Israel. You had the candlesticks, and you had the altar, the brazen altar, where all the sacrifices were offered every day. This is a picture of the cross, because a lamb was offered every morning at sun up, every evening at sunset, because the beginning of the day began at sunset, or around 6 o'clock in the morning. And we're lambs to the slaughter every day, aren't we? We're lambs on that altar every day. And the atonement lamb was offered on the 10th day of the 7th month, and it wasn't an atonement lamb, it was a goat. God has made him to be sin in our place or for us. That goat, he took our place on that, and that was the Day of Atonement, 7th month. And that was the Day of Atonement. And they had this fire on here. All fires were be kindled from that fire right there. I don't know what strange fire they offered. But boy, it was really serious to God, because God struck them dead right there in that 10th chapter. And the Bible talks about them all up through the law, that these sons of Aaron, these 2 sons, Nadab and Abihu, they offered strange fire. Now, they could have been, they had to have fire. All of it had to come from the altar. But the strange fire could have been, this was the altar of incense. Altar of incense. Now, some say what the priest would do, they would take this golden, it was like a ladle. They would Some said that to put the fire inside this, dipped it from the altar, and then they would sprinkle this incense upon that. The high priest he would take it inside the Holy of Holies on the Day of Atonement, and he would put it between the cherubim. They had a cherubim here facing this way, one facing this way. Of course, they had those four faces, the ox, the eagle, the lion, and man, and they had two here, and those were the four beasts on the altar in the 4th chapter of Revelation. And they say that they'd bring it in here and put that ladle here, that cup, and that they'd have to get the fire from this altar. I don't know whether they took fire from the candlesticks or whether they brought fire in here in this golden cup, ladle, and they had to have an exact formula for this incense on this incense altar. They may have not had the right formula. They may have gotten the fire from here. They may have got it from here with the wrong formula. Whatever they did, it was strange to God. And in this 10th chapter, that's what it's talking about. Then you get to the 11th chapter. Do we need the 11th chapter? Wonder what's happening in the 11th chapter of Leviticus. What's happening in the 11th chapter, you have the Levitical dietary laws. Is there anything wrong with that? Well, no, there's nothing wrong with that if you want to eat by that, but don't tell people they have to eat by that, because when you get to Romans, the 14th chapter, there's certain people come into the church eating like the Jews, real healthy. What's really funny about that 11th chapter, down here it will say, it's giving you all these different things you can and you cannot eat. And it will tell you that you cannot eat fish that have no fins. Well, I've had a heart operation. I had triple bypass in 2001. And my cardiologist said, don't eat shrimp, don't eat, and he'll say shrimp will increase the cholesterol in your blood.
Shellfish.
Shellfish. He said, don't eat shellfish. Okay. And that's what this chapter says.
Eat all the biscuits you can hold.
Huh? What'd you say? What?
Eat all the biscuits you can hold.
Okay. Mary makes lots of biscuits. Good biscuits. So, if you're in that 14th chapter, maybe y'all have heard me say, I've just off the cuff, I've said, you can't eat. You got people saying, well, you can't eat this Levitical law in the 14th chapter of Romans. Well, yes, you can. Paul said, receive these. Look at that real quick. But if you don't know about this 11th chapter of Leviticus, you're not going to know exactly what he's talking about. In fact, as you turn to Romans 14, you need to be able to study this 11th chapter of Leviticus in order to teach Romans 14. Romans 14, and I've said off the cuff, I've said, and that the dietary laws of the Jews in the Leviticus 11th chapter, I've said that. Does anybody remember me saying that?
Yeah.
I'll say it real quick without going to it. So I'm going to do this backwards and take you over to the 14th chapter of Romans. Him that is weak in the faith receive ye, but not to doubtful disputations. Don't be arguing with him. For one believeth he may eat all things, another who is weak in the faith eateth herbs only. Let him that eateth despise not him that eateth not. Let not him which eateth not judge him that eateth, for God hath received him. If you got people in the church over there at Rome, and they're trying to do the dietary laws of the Jews, And he goes on down here and says, who art thou that judgest another man's servant? Well, I wrote Adrian Rogers about Christmas being pagan, and he answers me back with this. Just dumb. It's not talking about whether you can keep pagan holidays, Adrian, even though you're dead. Maybe you can hear this. I don't know. It's talking about whether you're partaking of the dietary laws of the Jews. That's why he's saying that. He's not saying, well, it's okay to partake of Christmas. Our master standeth or falleth, yea, he is holding up, for God is able to make him stand. One esteemeth one day above another, and another esteemeth every day alike. He's not talking about whether you have a choice of partaking of a paganism like Christmas or like Christ's Mass. It's not what it's talking about. It's talking about the way the Jews partook of things. And he goes on down here, he that regardeth the day regardeth to the Lord. And then he says, for none of us liveth and dieth to himself. He says, we live and die unto the Lord. And he goes on down here talking about not putting a stumbling block in front of weak people. If somebody comes in here and they want to partake of Jewish rituals or Jewish customs, I will tell you we don't do that here. You can go off and eat what you want to eat, but I'm not going to allow people to make people to stumble. I say, if you want to do that here, you go ahead. But we don't believe in that. If it's something that was happening in the Old Testament under Jewish law, you got to be very careful with that, because you'll start teaching people to do Jewish rituals, and all the rituals are nailed to the cross of Christ. When he gets down to the end of this chapter, he says in verse 22, hast thou faith, have it to thyself before God. Happy is he that condemneth not himself in the thing which he allows. Don't condemn yourself by allowing the wrong things in the church. He's saying investigate everything. Then he says, and he that doubteth is damned if he eat, because he eateth not of faith. For whatsoever is not of faith is sin. Whatever doesn't die to self concerning your friends and your neighbors, concerning this. The point I'm bringing out, in order to fully study, and I can't fully bring out the 14th chapter of Romans, but it's talking about this 11th chapter of Leviticus. That's what it's talking about. Do I have any time left, Mike?
5 minutes.
All right. So, when you get out of Leviticus, the 11th chapter, you go to the 12th chapter. This is about a woman being cleansed in childbirth. And you go to Luke, the 2nd chapter, where Mary comes in Jerusalem to bring Jesus, and her 40 days of a quarantine is up. They had to have 40 days. They circumcised the child on the 8th day, and then they would come to Jerusalem after 40 days of a quarantine. This is according to the law, and Mary comes in Jerusalem, and that's where Simon or Simeon sees Christ and said, it's been said that I'll be able to see the Christ before it was revealed to me that I'll be able to see the Christ before I die, and he saw him that day. And there's other things in that 2nd chapter while Mary's in Jerusalem. So she was coming according to this 12th chapter of Leviticus. You think we need that if we're going to study the 2nd chapter of Luke? Do we need that? When people say you're repeating yourself, I'm trying to give you parts of all of these things. Then if you read the 13th and the 14th chapter of Leviticus, what's that about? Leprosy. Leper is a picture and a type of sin from one end of the Bible to the other. So you need to read that when you start reading about the lepers in the Gospels, being cleansed by Christ. Leprosy is a type of sin. It'll tell you how to detect whether it is deadly or whether it's just a temporary leprosy. And you go through here, do we need that? I don't know how to do all this without people griping about it, complaining. And you get over here to, it's talking about unclean men and women in the 15th chapter, and what kind of offerings they need to offer for atonement. You get to the 16th chapter, and what's in the 16th chapter of Leviticus? Does anybody remember? Huh? Day of Atonement. In the 17th chapter, what's in that? That you can't eat blood or drink blood. So if somebody wants to know, is it okay for me to eat or drink blood? Well, you're not supposed to. But health-wise, I don't know that it's bad for you. I don't know if it's good or bad. But all that's the rituals nailed to the cross. And in the 18th chapter, I quote part of that every time I'm preaching about Christmas. I quote the last 2 verses constantly. All that chapter is about them going after Molech and about rape. And you get down to the end of this, and Molech is in the 21st chapter about Israel letting their seed go through the fire to Molech. And in the 29th verse, for whosoever shall commit any of these abominations, even the souls that commit them shall be cut off from among the people. Therefore shall you keep mine ordinance that you commit not any one of these abominable customs. How many times have I quoted that? 1,000? Do we need all this? People say, I've already heard you preach. Well, I know you have. If you're not paying attention, do I need all this? Yeah, I need it. Am I out of time, Mike?
1 minute.
I don't have time to go any further. Maybe I'll come back to Leviticus and we'll see why we need Leviticus. You think we need Exodus, the 23rd chapter? Thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil. Do we need that? All through that 23rd chapter, he's talking about you can't. 23rd chapter of Exodus, where he gives us the 3 feasts that all the males had to come back to. Do we need that coupled with Acts, the 2nd chapter? They're scattered all over the earth. When they're taken out of Jerusalem and Judah and northern Israel, scattered throughout the earth, and all the males are given these decrees to come back. So, do we need that 23rd chapter of Exodus coupled with Acts, the 2nd chapter, where they're coming back from all over the world after having been scattered and they're all speaking different dialects and glossa? Do we need that? I know you people that already understand all this. I don't need to repeat this to you. When people say, you're just repeating yourself. The whole Old Testament is repeating itself. I'm going to go through all the major and I don't know how I can go through the major prophets, but I'll go through all the minor prophets. I consider Zechariah a major prophet because all the things he's got in Zechariah, whew, how can you do without it? But if you notice, all of this Old Testament is about Israel having gone after all these gods, and God scattered them all over the world, and all the prophets. I'd made this chart. I'm out of time, but I made this chart. If you don't have one, you need to stop over and get one. This chart right here, I made this up, and the lady typed it out for me. It takes you from Genesis up to the lineage of Adam, all the way down to Terah, the father of Abraham, then Abraham here. The 11th chapter, he comes on the scene. And then the 12th and the 17th chapter, the covenant of God to Abraham and Isaac, then Jacob, getting the covenant, 28th chapter. And then the sons of Jacob, Genesis 29 and 30. I asked you where they were last week. They're in 29 and 30. And we went through that. And then 32nd chapter of Genesis, Jacob's name is changed to Israel. This chart takes you through the Old Testament. Then you come to 37 through 50, and all I said was Joseph in bondage. I couldn't go through all that. And then I have him coming out of bondage, taking the children of Israel into the wilderness. And I got the judges named right here, all the judges in the book of Judges. And then I've got over here, here's the major prophets, and here's the minor prophets. And then we take off through Israel, through the kings, Saul, David, Solomon, the kingdom split, and then northern Israel goes into captivity after Hoshea, the last king of Israel, and then southern Judah goes into captivity, and these are the prophets of the captivity. And you're going to have to study all of them to find out what the Old Testament's about. What people mean, you keep preaching on the Old Testament. Well, I do that once a week. Do I think you could get that overnight? No, I don't believe it. It's a lot of stuff to get.
You can leave that with me.
Huh?
You can leave that with me. I'll take it home.
Okay. You need one? It's right there. All right. Well, let's go to the Lord in prayer, and I'm going to come back and resume why I'm repeating myself. I think people are funny that say that. You know what? How much is going through my mind that I want to impart to you? If I could just kind of get it over there, I would. Well, let's pray. Father, thank you for truth. Thank you for your word. God, we pray that you'll cause the sheep to hear, to bow, to be obedient to you. Lord, we love you with all our heart and soul. We just want to get this message to your elect, no one else. Thank you for truth. We'll praise you for all things, everything, because you're doing it all. In Christ's name, amen. We'll look at some more things in Leviticus and Numbers. I think they're all important.
Hey, sweet girls. How are you? I'm seeing you. You guys okay?
19.
Why'd she stay home? Why did she stay home?
Because she wanted to stay home with my mom. And there was only
Whew.
4, so Aaron had to stay.
Well, I hope that helps you.
He started fussing, so we just said that she would stay with Aaron.
Huh? I can't hear you. Okay. You said that last week. You said that last week.
Hi, Jim.
What you doing there, Rosie? I love you, little girl. I love you.
Love you.
You do.
Gum.
We sure can. You left your sis at home? You left her at home?
Yes.
Huh? You want red gum or yellow gum?
I want.
Watermelon gum or? Huh? Huh?
I want watermelon.
You want watermelon? Okay, here you go.
Thank you.
Okay,
Jim, can I ask you a question?
yeah.
In Acts 15, when it says that they should command that they abstain from
That's a good
pollution of
question.
idols,
Only thing I can think of when it's talking about things strangled, you've got that in the Old Testament. It's talking about animals that have been dead, they hadn't been bled. It's like when you kill a deer and you don't bleed it right, it tastes real bad. You can get sick from it. Maybe it's
so
just bleeding.
strangled and blood is kind of like one
Strangled,
thing.
strangled. Yeah, strangled is where they haven't been bled correctly. You can ask most hunters that. I've eaten deer
And
that.
you think the in blood part goes with the strangled?
Yeah,
Because down in Ecuador they would serve blood sausage,
yeah,
and I was never comfortable eating it.
yeah.
But I don't know if
What do you say?
I
oh, you're trying to steal.
I have
his
looked
thunder.
into that, and I was looking at the other night over in the Old Testament about things that have been killed. It's like roadkill is not good for you because the blood congeals, and if it congeals, it's not healthy. And rather than say if it's been dead for 5 minutes, nobody knows.
So it's probably good to stay away from it anyway, because it's
Yeah,
not gonna
it
be
probably
healthy
is.
for you.
It probably is. Yeah, I've looked at that
God
1,000
didn't- So God
times.
didn't really make blood to be eaten.
Evidently not. Because when you eat kosher, they bleed it. They bleed all the blood out of it.
Okay. And then in Romans 14, it's almost like that would apply more to them in their day than it does to
Well,
us.
it does, but still, people wanted to eat certain things, it was because they were eating according to the Jewish.
Right.
Their big argument was about whether the Jews were better than the Gentiles in the first part of the book. You got to
But
kind
it
of.
almost seems like nowadays, if you had like some type of messianic Jew or something like that wanted to hold to things like that, it'd almost be like you'd have to rebuke them for that, don't you? Don't you?
Yeah, you would, because they're
There would be a
trying.
whole attitude that he would have.
Yeah, it was probably more for their.
First